All right, next I want to take a look at a little bit of the countries that we didn't cover, a little bit of a regional view. We mostly focused on India and kind of the region as a whole, but I want to kind of highlight, let's talk a little bit about this regional view. So this is kind of a representation of East versus India's West versus East here. We have a little bit cultural differences we discussed, linguistic differences between the South, where they speak Dravidian-based languages, in the North, where the languages are a different language family, Indo-European. We have the country of Pakistan and its mountainous neighbor Afghanistan. We have these mountainous states. These are really like up in the Himalayas. We have the East, which is Bangladesh, part of India, Sri Lanka, and these islands called the Maldives. Right? So let's talk about these mountain states. Nepal and Bhutan up here, and you can see they're up in the Himalayas, and these are sparsely populated. These are not densely populated because they're in severe terrain up in the Himalayas. They're considered buffer states because India and China have been rivals over time. So these countries are a buffer state is a kind of a separate country that sits in between two rival countries, and so that's kind of been the role of these, is to kind of buffer between China and India. Here's some photos showing the the Himalayan environments here. These are the Maldives. Maldives are low islands, a big chain of low islands out in the Indian Ocean. More than 1,200 tiny islands here. You can see there's a picture of some of the islands, and they're relatively low as well. Then they're generally about most 6 feet above sea level. So that global warming and sea level rise is a real concern in these places. Just a side note about the Maldives. Maldives are kind of like there's money there. That these are places where people go to high-end vacation, and also there were a lot of offshore banking, things like that. So it's kind of like this little paradise type place out in the Indian Ocean, a lot of tourism, a lot of offshore banking, but concerned by rising sea levels. This is Sri Lanka down here, this island. It was known as Ceylon during the colonial period, and it gained its independence around the same time as India. And one thing different about it is that it's neither Hindu or Muslim, that it remains mostly Buddhist. It has a lot of, has maybe like 20 million people. It has a lot of agriculture, especially tea. Have you ever seen, when you look at the tea aisle, they have Ceylon tea? That Sri Lanka is a big big place for producing tea like you would drink. You do have some cultural differences, and let me just highlight something here. If you look at the satellite photo showing Sri Lanka, India, you can see that they're not completely separated from each other, but the connection between them is, as sea levels have risen since the ice ages, have become underwater. So it's kind of like how people walked to North America during the ice ages, but even going, not quite that long ago, people walked, to Sri Lanka from the Indian continent. Like, so over 2,000 years ago, the people who are the biggest population here walked over, across the straits here. And their culture is different. They're Buddhists. They speak an Indo-European type language. And then you have the Tamils, and the Tamils were brought over as migrant workers much later, during during the British Empire days. And they were brought over to work like migrant workers, and they come from this part of India. But their language is different, their religion is different. So you have kind of these two populations that live here. You have the Tamil population and the Sinhalese. And so one thing about Sri Lanka is that it's been involved in a lot of conflict. In the 80s, there was a bad civil war between the two groups. But I think it's eased up since then, but it's kind of made life difficult in this country. Next, let's talk about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is really divided up by the Hindu Kush Mountains, which kind of extend down into the heart of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's kind of weird because you don't have like a single Afghanistan culture. It's a collection of minorities from neighboring regions. It was not that many people live here. It's considered a buffer state between, so below here would have been the British Empire, and north of there would have been the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, and so if you kind of look what's beyond here, you get into South Asia. If you remember, South Asia is where you have the stands, right? In fact, these are stands too. We had, remember, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And so what you have is, instead of being like a single Afghan culture, you have Tajiks living in part of it. You have Turkmen, Uzbeks, people from these different cultures from these different stand countries living in different parts. You also have what are called the Pashtun, which are kind of more related to the people down here in Pakistan. So this is more Pashtun, there's more Tajik, you have, Uzbek. So there's no ethnic majority. It's just a collection of these different minorities. And this comes into play with conflicts. So for example, when the US has been involved in the war here, and the people the US were fighting were primarily Pashtun. The people that the US would recruit to help fight against them are primarily Tajik. So there's a lot of intercultural, there's a lot of, you can't, they're not all one culture. It's more complicated than that. When it comes to agriculture in this part of the world, one important part is illicit poppy seed growing. This is for the international drug trade that there's a lot of, Afghanistan is pretty remote, and a lot of places are not strictly regulated, to say the least. And so there's a lot of poppy, growing poppies, which are used to make heroin and other things, is part of the, cash crops in many places. It's very remote. This is called the Khyber Pass between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I just wanted to kind of show you that Hindu Kush landscape. The Khyber Pakhwana, or let's call it the Khyber area, is kind of the area that is between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So let's talk about Pakistan for a moment. There's kind of two areas. There's the Khyber Pass area up here that's very mountainous, but then there's the river lowlands here called the Punjab region. And if you remember that, so this is kind of showing the Punjab region of Pakistan next to the Punjab region of India. We talked about this before. And the Punjab region in Pakistan, we talked about how people sorted themselves out during the partition of India and Pakistan. So the Punjab part of Pakistan is like the Islamic core, because of the people who weren't Muslim left, and people in India who were kind of went over to the other side. So this is kind of the Islamic core part of Pakistan. So we saw this earlier. We have the Punjab region, which is associated more with Sikhism in India, but you also have a very Muslim Punjab region next door in Pakistan. At one time, before the countries were partitioned, this was all kind of one administrative region, but the British kind of just sliced it up and broke it into two parts, one part in India, one part in Pakistan.